Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Cooney, or Beck, some of you know me as. I'm the North American executive editor of The Lancet, and I am just so delighted to have you all here. We've been just so amazed at the response to The LancetWomen, and it's because of all of you. So I'd also really like to give our very, very big thanks to Jocalyn Clark, who was really one of the, yes, who along with Liz Zuccalla and Richard Horton really were the engine behind this whole idea and really mobilizing things and getting the right people together to really get the work out there. And also big thanks to Columbia for hosting us today and the Helmsley Charitable Trust who made today possible. So sit back and relax and enjoy the show.
Hi. I'm Terry McGovern. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of Columbia University Medical Center and the Mailman School of Public Health. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Population and Family Health, and I am the director of a new program on global health, justice, and governance, which actually focuses on gender justice, among other things. We are so thrilled to launch this, to host this launch today. Congratulations to The Lancet and the authors in this volume. The opening editorial states that The Lancet's aim is to showcase research, commentary, and analysis that provides new explanations and evidence for action towards gender equity. It couldn't come at a better time, huh? The conclusion from all of the submissions is that to make meaningful change, actions must be directed at transforming the systems women work within. And hopefully that's what we're going to be talking about today. This theme shows that more diverse teams lead to better science and to better organizations. A couple of things from a close read of the edition this weekend. Normal, we learned, is male, and I would add white. The genetics, anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and healthcare experience of women have been under-researched and under-addressed in the health sciences. This continues today. The silent killer, implicit bias, unconscious bias, discriminatory behavior. The context is urgent. 200 million women who want to avoid pregnancy lack access to contraception. 45 million have inadequate or no antenatal care. 25 million women have unsafe abortions each year. 1 in 3 experience sexual violence. 1 million deaths annually from breast, cervix, uterus, ovarian cancers. The essential package of sexual and reproductive health is still ignored around the world. Sexual harassment continues in many, many institutions. I'd really like to thank The Lancet for taking on these very complex issues, joining us here in New York, the generous and incredible sponsor, the Leona and Harry Helmsley Charitable Trust. I also want to thank our students and staff, Margot Kotler, Lizzie Schroeder, Tess Solomon, Mallory Sheff, who've been working really hard for this event, and we look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gina Agiostratidou, and I'm the director of the Type 1 Diabetes Program at the Helmsley Trust. As you may know, Helmsley is actually here in New York City. We fund through 6 programs, but the 2 of the programs, they focus on severe chronic diseases, Type 1 diabetes and Crohn's disease. I'm a molecular biologist by training, and a couple of decades ago, I started doing my PhD. And what I observed that everywhere in my PhD class, most of them were women. But no woman was in a leadership position in the lab or in the university. And as a naive, a young person, I thought that would change. As everything evolves, that gender inequity will also change. But I think in my disappointment, this didn't happen. Recently, I went to a conference about type 1 diabetes in London. 90 different conferences, just an average science conference. And I counted that less than 20% actually of the speakers were women. And if we look about keynote speakers, there was no any woman. Last week, we were in Bangkok to talk about global non-communicable diseases. If you ask me how many women were represented in panels, I would say very, very few. I never thought that actually would be today and have a special Lancet issue that is dedicated to advance gender equity in science, medicine, and global health. But reality is that I'm not only a scientist, I'm a pragmatist. And until we have parity, we will keep missing up the full pool of talent, a pool of talent that we need to have progress for better outcomes for people or well-being. For me, gender equity in science and medicine is fundamentally about ensuring that we have the clearest possible path to producing the best possible outcomes. The issue of Lancet shines a much-needed light in problems that we see because of gender inequity. One of the most stunning analyses, and I think it's similar to what Terry you said, is that there are only 1/3 of biomedical studies include data disaggregated by sex, despite numerous studies that they show sex-based differences for genetic, cellular, biochemical, and physical levels. Notably, one of these third, female authors are more likely to report sex differences in their studies. Are they better scientists? Are they more rigorous and comprehensive what they're doing? We don't know. This issue also illustrates that there are wide gaps in gender and ethnic representation in the top universities in the US, in UK, and in Canada, and from personal experience in many other countries. If we are truly and effectively want to serve the global population, it is imperative that we have people who teach the next generation in science, medicine, and global health, who really reflect the population, who has a diverse perspective and experiences. We at Helmsley, we have a vision that is reflected through our grant making, a world where gender, color of skin, geography does not dictate the outcomes and the opportunities of anybody. So we are very pleased to support this gathering today and share the beginning of a new and more inclusive chapter in science and medicine. Really thank you for all being here, and thank you to Lancet for really taking the initiative to bring women in the front. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm Jocalyn Clark, an executive editor at The Lancet, and I am delighted to be here and to welcome all of you who have joined us in person here in New York City for the launch of our theme issue on women in science, medicine, and global health. And I want to welcome everyone who's joined us on the live stream. We're grateful for your presence and looking forward to a really, really great afternoon. I've come to New York from London, totally still buzzing from our launch on Friday. This theme issue went live on Friday morning, and we held an all-day event in London with a group of people much like you, some institutional leaders, some clinicians, men and women across the career spectrum. And we had a very, very fruitful discussion, which I expect we will have today. So we're very grateful to be here and to have your engagement on our theme issue. I've also just, literally half an hour ago, come from the United Nations, where there is an event taking place today to mark the International Day of Girls and Women in Science. And this is, I think, in its third year, a wonderful kind of international convening around the need for us to invest more and create more visibility and profile of girls and women in science. And it was really, really gratifying because in the opening remarks, twice the LancetWomen theme issue was mentioned. And indeed, directly quoted from was that lead editorial that we heard about a couple of minutes ago. So before I kick off my session, I would really like to thank the Helmsley Charitable Trust, and Gina, thank you for those wonderful words of opening, for your support of today's event and all the work that you do. Terry McGovern and her team here at Columbia, a very good friend of the Lancet, and we're really so happy that you offered to host us, so thank you. It's a beautiful space. And to Beck Cooney and Aaron Van Dorn, my very good Lancet colleagues who are here in the New York office. Really just so pleased to be working with you on this event, and thanks for all your support of the Lancet issue. For all the panelists and speakers, I can't wait to hear from you today, and I'm sure our audience is eager to as well. Thank you for accepting our invitation to come speak. So let's talk about the program. Very exciting, but as you can tell, it's going to be a very quick and efficient sort of taster, if you will, of our theme issue. Each of our sessions is designed around a theme. In this first session, myself and my dream team of panelists are going to talk about some content that appeared in this week's theme issue on women in science, medicine, and global health. And then we're going to move on to a session that Terry McGovern is chairing that's going to take a bit of a deep dive into some global health leadership issues. And then we'll hand the floor over to Beck Cooney again with the announcement of a new Lancet commission and discussion. And then we will finish with a panel discussion. So we're all meant to self-moderate ourselves and try to stick to time. But hopefully we'll have a lot of time for discussion and questions. So here's our theme issue, which all of you have in your delegate bag. We launched this on, as I said, on Friday, February 8th. It is a remarkable achievement, remarkable because of all the amount of work that went into it and the massive response we got to our call for papers. We called for papers back in December 2017 with a commentary, and we received over 300 submissions from more than 40 countries in the world. This was simply unexpected and quite astonishing, but really reflects the kind of deep work that's being done in this field from, across these different sectors, but also across the world, and we're really, really proud of it. It's effectively a double issue. The Lancet normally publishes about 84 pages a week. This is cover to cover, about 130 pages of research, of commentary, of analysis. Every single section is devoted to this theme. And then we also have, which you can access on our website, different sort of pieces. There's profiles, there's a podcast, and as we say in our podcast, there's something here for everyone. And we don't think you've ever seen a medical journal like this. As Beck said at the top, this theme issue actually was the idea of our editor-in-chief, Richard Horton, who asked my colleague Liz Zuccalla and I if we might take it on. Liz has been a tremendous collaborator. She was very sensible 18 months ago when Richard asked us if we wanted to lead this project. She wanted to think about it a little while. I could characteristically almost jumped out of my skin to say yes. This was a tremendous opportunity for us, and together with our team at the Lancet and a great many people from around the world. Here I display for you a picture of the speakers and panelists in London on Friday who came from, as I said, a number of different fields within science, medicine, and global health, and a great deal of diversity as well. I think one thing we're very proud of is that we're very explicitly a feminist approach to this theme issue. And we called for action in our theme issue to say that the fight for gender equity is everyone's responsibility. And we feel that feminism is also for everybody, for men, for women, for researchers, for clinicians, funders, institutional leaders, and medical journals. We feel this theme issue lays out robust evidence of bias within these systems and that there's now a need for action and accountability. We were very much interested in taking a structural approach rather than a more individualized approach, which is, yes, important, but often doesn't lead to the kind of systemic change we want. So we're calling on institutional leaders to confront the gender bias that exists, to improve diversity and inclusivity, and to drive change. Judging from the media coverage of the theme issue that we've had over the last couple of days, it's these main research articles that really seem to have been taken up by people. We show in this theme issue, our colleagues that we publish, that there are gender gaps in funding and that they have to do with assessments of women rather than on the proposed science. We also show, using a massive bibliometric analysis, colleagues from Montreal, that very few studies still include data on sex, and this very much restricts the real-world relevance of findings. And then we also had a very nice piece that showed that actually, as many of you can appreciate, more and more so, our top universities are pledging that they're interested in driving gender and diversity, but actually that's more talk than action. And here we have some hard evidence to demonstrate that. We have had a lot of pickup on social media, I think, for those of you who have followed the LancetWomen hashtag. There's been really great engagement around the world, but we've had just in the last couple of days great pickup across the mainstream and scientific press. We also have a lot of analysis and commentary. This is just giving you a little bit of a flavor and to invite you to spend time reading the theme issue, and really we're very interested in hearing what you have to say about it. Our theme issue can be accessed using this URL. The live stream of London's launch has been recorded, so if you weren't able to follow along with us on Friday, please do go back to that URL and take a look, and please feed back to us and join the conversation. I am going to now hand over to three fabulous panelists whose remarkable accomplishments and credentials could take the next 30 minutes that I have available to me. But I'm just so pleased to welcome them. And they are first Janine Clayton, who's the director of the NIH Office of Research on Women's Health. And then two of our LancetWomen Advisory Group members, Reshma Jagsi from the University of Michigan, who's traveled to be with us today, and Rosemary Morgan from Johns Hopkins, who also has. So I'd like to hand over to Janine, please, to talk about her piece that appeared in LancetWomen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocalyn, and thank you to Columbia, and kudos to the Lancet. Incredible work. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to speed through this content pretty quickly because we have such amazing folks here to talk today. But we believe at NIH that workforce equity paves the way for better science and health equity, and it was my pleasure to be able to co-author a piece in Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology talking about the role of education, about sex and gender across the research continuum and how that leads to better science and better health. And so the approach that we took there is one that we are taking at NIH, and that is that we need to intentionally integrate considerations of sex and gender across the biomedical research continuum. All the way on the left from our basic science studies, where we're working on animal models, and then a preclinical studies as we translate those findings into people in a phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. When we are reporting those results, sex-specific analyses and results, clearly publication is a key issue here, and that's why it's so important for the work that the Lancet has done to be spread wide. And then as we go back to the clinic and try to implement that evidence, how are we going to implement evidence if we do not know to whom the evidence applies? If the data aren't disaggregated, if we don't understand, how are we to do that? And that's a big challenge. We want healthy men, women, boys, and girls, and gender diverse people. We want that information and evidence to inform health policy. It cannot inform health policy if it is not appropriately disaggregated or interpreted in that context. And certainly each and every one of us deserves sex and gender appropriate evidence-based healthcare when we are patients. What is central to all of this? Education. There's a clear need for that. And we do know a diverse, well-informed, well-educated biomedical research workforce yields better science and better health. We know that gender diversity enhances outcomes, be it on a board of a Fortune 500 company or on a group of interdisciplinary researchers, better outcomes exist. But it is not just diversity in equals discovery and innovation out. And I cite this PNAS paper where really the issue was brought up that we need to understand about flattening hierarchical systems, critical mass, the role of engaging different management styles, diversifying research methods. We can't just put diversity in and expect discovery and innovation out. It requires intentionality. And I'm excited to share with you a new Trans-NIH strategic plan for women's health research. The arrow highlights our fourth goal around promoting training and careers to advance science for the health of women. And this is specifically well aligned with what we are here to talk about today. The first up at the top is enhancing knowledge of sex and gender influences, because we know that makes a difference as we develop the next generation, promote efforts to retain and have sustained advancement of women in STEM so women achieve their full potential. Supporting policies, mentoring and infrastructure changes, systemic changes, structural changes. It is not about fixing the women. And research barriers and interventions to advance women, but more importantly, all of this can come together to advance research from our perspective at the Office of Research on Women's Health to advance rigorous and relevant research. Now, why hasn't all of this evidence that's been generated been applied? That's a good question. There are a lot of disincentives, incentives in our systems, and we're looking at why that graph on the right, and this is very US specific, I apologize. The US population is on the right. You don't even need to be able to read those white text there to say that isn't matching. The US population is not matching the constitution of the science and engineering workforce. Why is that? So we are going to be funding a study to look at that, and I just mentioned that here for you. And again, I followed my moderators and new leaders' instructions about keeping this short. I'm so excited to be here, and again, congratulations to the Lancet. Thank you to Columbia University and other sponsors here today.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. My very first work on women and gender equity in medicine was actually a paper on the gender gap in authorship in major medical journals. And for years, I've thought to myself, my goodness, there's so much that medical journals could do. And I have to say, the Lancet has exceeded my expectations as to what a major medical journal could do, both in terms of bringing these issues to light, but also inspiring research in this area. So I'm so incredibly grateful to be included today. What I've been asked to speak about are some key actions specific to clinical medicine relating to training and institutional environments, focused on one of those 3 research articles that Dr. Clark mentioned, and a couple of commentaries that I was part of as well. So one of the articles was a lovely qualitative analysis of the experiences of women who had left surgical training in Australia. And what they found was that stresses appeared to accumulate like a tower of stacked blocks. And eventually that tower for each woman reached a height that would topple in the absence of some sort of effort to stabilize that tower. And often the final precipitator of the toppling actually appeared to be relatively minor. And so what they concluded was that interventions must address the underlying multiple and constituent factors, the blocks, rather than narrowly focus on the ultimate triggers, and that ideally these interventions would not be gender specific in order to avoid reinforcing stereotypes. So what are those blocks and how do we stabilize the tower? We wrote about this a bit in a commentary that accompanied that article. There are many barriers that women in surgery face, and these were detailed nicely by the authors: long working hours, fatigue, unpredictable lifestyle, unavailability of leave, and the ensuing effect of these generally inflexible and all-consuming professional expectations on personal relationships, especially in a society where there are gendered expectations of the division of domestic labor. And so we talked about policies, because again, this is not about fixing the women, this is about fixing the system. And so how can we fix the system? There are policies relating to regulations of duty hours, which unsurprisingly are endorsed more favorably by women than men. And there is considerable evidence that when done right, these can actually be accomplished without any detriment to education or quality of care or dedication. We need revision of parental leave policies to emphasize competencies rather than time requirements. At a time that graduate medical education is moving more and more towards competency-based evaluation, it is very strange to me that the policies of individual institutions and of the member boards of the American Boards of Medical Specialties seem to have actually become more focused on the time that's being spent in medical training. We're all aware of issues of workplace incivility, bullying, and sexual harassment. So what can institutions do? We can all measure, both to guide evidence-based intervention and to communicate that organizations do not tolerate that conduct, because of course that is the strongest predictor of harassment. We can facilitate reporting, offer choices both with respect to gender and identity of the informants, but also with respect to their rank and position within the organization. We can disseminate and enforce the policies we do have, including policies that relate to harassment by patients and families, because this is a unique challenge faced by women in clinical medicine. And ultimately, we must transform the culture. And this is possible through many means, including demonstrated interventions that focus on civility and respect, and bystanders. We can advocate to changes to the structures that support harassment by employing more women, promoting more women, and integrating more women into every level of the organization. The goal must be a well-integrated, structurally egalitarian workplace in which women and men equally share power and authority. So how do we move from Me Too to Time's Up? We are privileged to inhabit a momentous time in history. We truly have an opportunity right now, a policy window, so to speak, to move from awareness to action. And the Time's Up movement actually teaches us that we can use a healthcare quality improvement framework, structures, processes, outcomes, and through measurement and action, we can inform change. It is absolutely critical for us to come together to promote equity, both for its own sake and to ultimately promote each of the worthy ends that our profession serves: the clinical mission, the pedagogical mission, and the scholarly mission. I am so thrilled to have been a very small part of this wonderful theme issue and to be here with you today to celebrate this.
Hello, so I'm Rosemary Morgan. I'm based at Johns Hopkins, on faculty there in the School of Public Health. I'm going to be talking today about a broader issue that is throughout a lot of the papers and contributions in the series, and that is power and privilege in global health, but also in medicine and science more broadly. So about 2 weeks ago, I attended the Dean's State of the School address at my school, our first female dean. During the presentation, she proudly outlined the fact that 60% of all faculty at the school were now women. That same day, I was talking to an older male colleague who questioned these figures, not questioning the lack of disaggregated data by job level, which I had mentally done, but the fact that she brought this number up very proudly despite the number of men in the room. What's next, he asked me, 80%, 90%, 100%? The complete dismantling of patriarchy? Didn't she see the irony in that? I thought, no, I don't see how that's ironic at all, but I did reply, I mean, to me, the dismantling of patriarchy is never a bad thing. So the beginning of a paper by Barnes and Munch titled "The Paradoxical Privilege of Men and Masculinity in Institutional Review Boards," published in 2015 in Feminist Studies, starts off in the following way. In the 1939 Hollywood classic, The Wizard of Oz, the great wizard admonishes Dorothy and her friends to pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Dorothy and company turn to see a man standing before a large control panel operating the smoke, holographic image and voice of the great wizard. Realizing he has been discovered, the man gives up manipulating the switches and the nebulous wizard vanishes. Hegemonic masculinity is analogous to the all-powerful wizard. In order to maintain its grandeur, power, and mystique, the mechanics of masculine ideology, as well as the social actors who participate in its reproduction, must be kept hidden. A crucial aim of feminist research is to pull back the curtain. This quote and the conversation with my male colleague highlighted the importance of this special issue to me, of shining light on the structural and social systems of oppression that produce inequalities that disadvantaged women and other marginalized groups within our research, within our institutions, and within the systems that support these. So my conversation with my male colleague and the evidence presented within this issue show us how much more work is still needed to address gender inequity within academia and within global health more broadly. And that unless we work together, we will struggle to pull back the heavy curtain that has weighed so many down for so long. Going back to the dean's presentation, the same slide that outlined that 60% representation of women on faculty at the School of Public Health also showed the percentage of underrepresented minorities or people of color on faculty within the school by job category. While just over 50% of Americans are people of color, however, within the school they make up roughly between 8 and 20% across the different job categories, with some even dropping recently in the last few years. While I was left wondering what the percentage of people of color were women and what percentage were men, the fact that these numbers were shown at all is impressive. As Kimberly Crenshaw says, you can't address a problem if you can't see a problem. This all highlights the fact that the institutions in which we work are themselves situated and rooted within historical and social systems and structures of oppression, which have actively privileged whole groups of individuals based on their sex and/or color of their skin, not to mention other visible or invisible social stratifiers such as disability, sexual orientation, age, and geographic location. So I live in Baltimore, and this graph shows us the maternal mortality rate by race in Maryland between 2004 and 2014. As you can see in the graph, the maternal mortality rate for African American women is 49.1 per 100,000 live births, compared to 17.7 for Caucasian women. And evidence even shows that having a higher economic status is not protective. We still see similar numbers. The problem here is so much bigger than patriarchy. As global health researchers, we must not only challenge gender inequities that are reinforced by patriarchal systems and structures, but also other forms of inequity and their intersections with patriarchy, such as racism. If anything, what this series in the Lancet shows us is that the global health community needs to do better at actively seeking to understand and address systems and structures of oppression and privilege, both within our research and within our institutions. To me, advocating for social justice is an important part of global health research, whether this is globally or within our own backyard. I conduct training on intersectionality for health systems researchers and often show this graph. I debated with myself about whether or not I should include this, as the first time I brought this issue up, I couldn't finish and had to sit down, and I'm doing it again, and let someone else carry on due to getting too emotional. And the one thing that kept going through my head is, that's it, no one will take me seriously now. Which is in itself another reason why this special issue is so important, to turn the patriarchal system on its head, which tells us that we are weak if we show emotion at work. And I have to stop showing this, this graph. We do not simply need a gender lens, we need an intersectional gender lens. As highlighted by Sarah Davies and co-authors within this series, we must mainstream intersectionality throughout our research, programs, and interventions. Within global health, we must also pay attention to who is present and whose voices are heard, and who is left out of the conversation. Within our academic community, within our decision-making structures, and bodies, and within our research. Sarah Davies and co-authors end their paper by stating, above all, the global health agenda must be feminist. A feminist global health agenda is one in which seeks to understand and address intersecting systems and structures of oppression and privilege. This series provides an important contribution to this work by helping to shine light on the structural and social systems of oppression that produce inequalities that have and continue to disadvantage women and other marginalized groups within global health. It is helping to pull back the curtain of patriarchy, because quite frankly, as we all know, the patriarchy is not going to smash itself. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, what a way to start our afternoon in celebration of this theme issue. Thank you, Janine and Reshma and Rosemary, for the honor of your presence. And for introducing to everyone the wonderful breadth and depth of this theme issue. I'm so privileged and grateful that we've had so much support and interest in the theme issue. And I mean, obviously, we all have a lot of passion and deep experience fighting this good fight. So I really do appreciate that. To close the session, I wanted to add one more thread. This is really close to my heart, something very important to me, and that's what the Lancet has pledged and committed to via this theme issue. It's also a set of commitments that are very important to our editor-in-chief. He emphasized them on London when we launched the theme issue. This is the last commentary in the theme issue, and I invite you to read it, but I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights. I mean, I think we all recognize the centrality of journals in disseminating scientific knowledge, but also how influential they can be in shaping not just practice and policy, but also the culture of medicine and science. But we know that there's lots of evidence to show that women are underrepresented as editors, authors, reviewers, as Janine told us so eloquently and has devoted her career to changing the fact that sex and gender-related reporting of science is very poor, despite there being institutional policies. But diversity and inclusivity are absolutely crucial. For us as a journal at The Lancet, crucial to our values, but also clearly, as you can agree, crucial to our performance. And yet we're part of this broader ecosystem, very much in which there are determinants more upstream than us in academia and in funding, but also that we're a part of. And my argument here is that by being part of one part of this system, we're a part of all of it. That makes us a part of the problem of a vicious circle that effectively makes women and their contributions to science and medicine and global health invisible. We have, I think unusually for a journal, though by no means without precedent, a very vastly female editorial workforce. At The Lancet, at the weekly journal, we're about 84% women, including 3 of 5 women on our senior management team. Unfortunately, like a lot of other journals, we have a vastly male-dominated set of peer reviewers. In 2017, for which I conducted an audit of our internal processes at The Lancet, we were using just 22% of our peer reviewers were men. We looked across a number of our specialty journals. We looked at areas of medicine that we publish a lot on, and it's fairly consistent that the vast majority of peer reviewers are male. It's a particular problem in some areas, like cardiology, which the Lancet publishes a great deal on. We'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. Just 12.7% of peer reviewers for our cardiology content were women. This has been documented by others in the field who show that actually some of the worst performers in terms of gender balance of peer reviewers are the highest impact medical journals. Author gender in the Lancet journals really varies, but no journal in our family of journals is publishing research where women comprise more than 50% of authors. We did a deep dive to look at some of our series and commissions and identified some areas that are a particular problem. So cardiology, again, appears to be one where we're commissioning series and content, allowing author teams to be vastly dominated by men. In some areas, we have seen improvement over time. So that section of the journal that publishes commentary, which is the section that I lead, there's 4 members on our team. We have actually begun to exercise positive action so that we are deliberately seeking out women authors and authors from the Global South. We're also putting it in all our commissioning letters, and this alone has really improved the number of female authors over time. So in this commentary, I want to share with you that we have made some commitments. First of all, we're creating a diversity pledge. This will show our commitment to readers, and it's going to display everywhere on our website, our instructions for authors, etc. We are going to have gender parity on all our editorial advisory boards by the end of 2019. We already have 5 of 13 journals that have at least 50% women currently. We are going to increase the proportion of women and reviewers from the Global Health by 25%. And for all our series and commissions, the Lancet does a lot of these sort of collections of themed content. These are largely commissioned, therefore we have more control over the authors that participate in those projects. We are now going to require that at least 50% women and 50% Global South contributors are on those projects. That we will now make it a requirement for all lead authors and all editors who are handling those projects to justify why those ratios have not been met. And we are going to continue to exercise what we call positive action in diversifying our authors across a lot of different sections. Commentaries, our World Report, which is our news section, reviews, seminars, and other commissioned and invited content. In order to do this, requires us to vastly grow and diversify our networks. Here I'm showing you some photos from Friday's launch in London, just to show you what can be done when you put your mind to it. Incredible leaders across, as I said, seniority, across ethnicity, across geography came together. So we really want to build on this to create a larger pool of reviewers and authors by better utilizing our boards, engaging with younger researchers within the clinical and academic societies that we work, introduce more time into our workflow so that we really are searching and identifying. We know those experts are out there. We just need to introduce this better into our flow so that we're finding people across gender, geography, ethnic background, career stage, and sector. And we really need your help as readers, as supporters, as friends, as advocates of the journal to provide us with suggestions and feedback for how we can do this. Clearly, we're going to continue to campaign for change. Both the academic environment and funding environments need to address the known and documented bias in their systems for us to diversify. So this is a call to action, a call for some accountability on their parts. I'm going to finish there on that note because I think it's a high one and I think it's really important. We are a journal of record on equity, on social justice and on health, and we're going to build on that to campaign for gender equity. In 2018 alone, not including this theme issue, we wrote 8 lead editorials on driving change for gender equity, and we published about 25 different pieces. I'm not aware, and I've worked at other major medical journals, I'm not aware of any other journal that's done that. This is just the beginning for us. Thank you.
Okay, I have the honor of moderating and participating on, I think, what was really meant to be a somewhat provocative session on global health in focus, leadership on tough issues, evidence over ideology. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce my 2 co-panelists. Sharmila Mhatre is the Deputy Director of the Open Society Public Health Program. She's right here. Her expertise in health systems and policy research in low and middle income countries comes from over 20 years of experience leading, designing, and managing multi-sectoral health programs with government, donor, and civil society collaborators in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. Prior to joining Open Society, she worked at Canada's International Development Research Centre, where she headed the Governance for Equity and Health Systems program. The program supported leading scholars, policymakers, and civil society organizations from low and middle income countries to redress health inequities. She worked from 1996 to 2003 as a research fellow with the non-governmental agency Community Information and Epidemiological Technologies. Again, her research was on primary health care, community-based information systems, prevention of sexual violence, and HIV/AIDS in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She also worked at UNICEF. I am really, really grateful to Nana Kuau, who joined us because Anita Zaidi is snowed in Seattle. She was supposed to be one of our panelists, so thank you. Nana is a development economist and public policy specialist with over 14 years experience in global health, rural development, HIV, and public health, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. She's currently the senior manager of the Every Woman, Every Child Health Team in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General of the United Nations. It's a special initiative of the UN Secretary General launched in 2010 for an unprecedented global movement to mobilize and intensify international and national action by governments, the UN, civil society, the private sector, and multilaterals to save and improve the lives of millions of women and children around the world. Prior to this, she was the UN AIDS country coordinator in China and spent over 5 years working in China with UN AIDS. She coordinated the China-UN system support to the International Roundtable on China-Africa Health Cooperation, the first to be held in Africa in Botswana. She also provided inputs to the Ministerial Forum of China-Africa Health Development. Both of these panelists have vast amounts of experience. I will say that you heard who I am earlier, but I began my career in 1989 as a poverty lawyer in 1987, actually, just as the HIV epidemic hit the city. And one of the first things I saw were women who were HIV positive who died before they ever got AIDS, died before they ever got Medicaid or disability, and many of the activists were saying that's because they didn't study women in the early trials around HIV. And guess what? They hadn't, and we filed the class action and were able to push that definition that was used by disability, expand the AIDS definition. So very early on, I experienced directly these issues that are being discussed today. Sadly, none of my clients lived to see the day when the AIDS definition was expanded, but I always think of them when I talk about these issues. For a panel on global health and gender evidence over ideology, of course, Sinite suggested that somebody had to talk about sexual reproductive health and abortion, because how can we not talk about evidence over ideology and talk about these issues? I will talk about that, but I also want to make some remarks on the broader context of women and girls' lives and health. I noticed at a recent Women's Global Health Conference, there was not much specific discussion of intersecting oppression, fundamentalisms, the impact of law, racism, economic oppression, except as all a basket of inequalities, colonialism, militarization, environmental exploitation, misuse of religion, violence, bias, or an acknowledgement that the lack of evidence on certain phenomenon, such as adverse health consequences of environmental exposures, might actually be because of structural barriers to the creation of evidence. Yet all of these factors play a huge role in women's health. Whenever I ask about these issues, I'm often told these are political economy issues. You're talking about the political economy. Actually, we're talking about the context of women's lives. I was discussing this with colleagues in the department, and we agreed that these are what should be called the political determinants of women's health. They loom large, but they receive far too little attention. This may be law, harmful norms or practices, or the fact that environmental degradation is causing adverse health consequences, but industry is blocking adequate research. So I'm happy to talk about abortion for a second or a bit, but I want to flag the need to really address all of these other issues. Access to safe abortion is a stark example, however, of ideology over evidence. So contrary to much rhetoric, abortion arises organically in communities throughout the world. It always has. It's not a result of imposed Western ideology. In fact, women in the US today have learned lots from the nimble ways women around the world have responded to the illegality of abortion for centuries. Some evidence, roughly globally, 1 in 8 maternal deaths are due to unsafe abortion. It can cause post-abortion sepsis, hemorrhage, genital trauma. Deaths due to unsafe abortion are severely underreported. Stigma, discrimination, no death certificates, no record of the pregnancy. Since we're sitting in New York City, I don't have to tell you about the 347 measures to restrict abortion that were introduced in 37 states in the first 3 months of 2018. Obviously, even with incomplete data, we know there are huge inequalities in abortion. A lot of the unsafe abortions happen in poor contexts. In Senegal, poor women are far more likely to experience abortion complications than non-poor women. This pattern holds true in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, throughout the world. I want to focus a minute on humanitarian settings, which my colleague Sarah Casey here works on. 61% of maternal deaths worldwide occur in fragile states, yet we still don't have much of the humanitarian sector addressing access to sexual and reproductive health, and particularly safe abortion. We know that girls fleeing countries are at particular risk. Why don't we have these services? Why don't we have these services? Ideology over evidence. Despite greater need, adolescents have worse access to health services in crises than anyone else. And despite the inclusion of these protections in international law, still these services don't exist. Evidence, ideology over evidence. We have a long way to go to start pushing for what is medically sound. We know that improving access to contraception and safe abortion will improve our health outcomes. And we know that it is pure ideology that keeps it from happening. I'm hoping in the course of our next two speakers, we can touch on things like the failure of the MDGs to address abortion, still the failure of much of the global structures to address the humanitarian or conflict crises, and what we can really do to bring development, human rights, humanitarian sectors, all these different sectors together for better health outcomes for women and girls. Sharmila.
Thank you, Terry. I just want to start off first by saying that, after reading the Friday Lancet, I think it's the first time I've seen that F word so many times, and it was incredibly energizing. I actually did a content search, and I think it came out 29 hits only in all the history of the Lancet. So thank you, Jocalyn, Beck, and Richard Horton for that. Just to get a sense of the room, I want to ask if everybody could, who are funders, put their hands up for me. Okay, funders, if you're funders. How many are reviewers of research proposals or proposals in general? Review proposals, okay. How many submit proposals? Okay, so that you guys are in the majority. Okay, so what I really want to focus on is to make sure that I'm a funder, as that we are not part of the problem here. I'm part of the leadership of a health program of the second largest foundation. I just want to point out my colleague Amanda Donnell here. She is also here, and since I'm a funder, I'm on this panel. And we're going to be dealing with the issues I'd like to deal with. What are the tough issues as a funder? I am Indian by birth and a Canadian citizen, and I think that's important because I want to say my gender is not binary, and that means that I am a woman of color, of a certain class, of a certain privilege of education, and a certain ability. I am also both North and South. So part of my definition, and I think, this is a room where we think we need to have, we're not going to break down and dismantle. Risha, I would like to not just stabilize the tower, but talk about how we can transform the tower. My understanding of gender is about power systems. And that means transforming social, economic, political, a lot of the issues that Terry was talking about, as well as the hearts and minds of individuals around the intersection of gender, race, religion, sexuality, class, and caste. I also don't believe that any research is bias-free or ideologically free. And I work for a foundation that has a very clear ideology, and I'm proud of it. The clear ideology is called promoting democratic societies and tolerance. And in a world of fake news, we as researchers, and I'm saying we, I am a researcher by training, cannot be righteous about this concept of evidence. In fact, I think we need to, and I see many of the social science really embracing different methodologies and approaches like narrative change to actually see and use evidence as an intervention, as a mobilizer, rather than just as a document or an end product of talking about the state of the problem. I see Steffi there, who's heading the Lancet Commission looking at health policy in this era, and I know that she's working on that. What I'd like to just focus on is really about leadership and the tough issues. The tough issue which challenges me every day, and at the same time which actually motivates me to come to work every day, is about changing the power system. You can call it a feminist agenda, I am a feminist, or perhaps I want to introduce a new term, intersectional inclusion. Because too often I think feminism or gender is seen as a women's issue, and I am not only a woman. So what does this actually mean in practice for a funder? And I think for me it boils down to, and after sort of years of both being in the field and as a funder, is really asking the question, is the money going to those who are framing the problem and the solution and making the change? Is that where the money's going? To help explain why this is important, I'm really going to take you to a different place, out of research and science into the world of art, and tell you a story of a group of artists the Progressives, as they are finally now called after 60 years. And it is a group of artists, a group of all men, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian. So imagine it's 1947. India is finally a free country, free from colonial rule. There is a family link, as my great-grandfather and my grandfather were part of the insurgency and were incarcerated as a result of their actions, like so many at that time. But India was born. And a group of artists came together and over 3 decades gave visual expression through their art to the dream that the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, had, a dream of unity in diversity. So these artists, beginning in Mumbai, at that time called Bombay, traveled to Paris, to New York. And this was funded by American philanthropists. And they took a leaf out of the book of the Western artists. Yet it needs to be recognized that the West had already mined the East for their creative inspiration. Picasso drew from African masks, Matisse from Persian miniatures. These male artists, they returned back home to India, and now their collective included women, both Indian and non-Indian, and in the art world, they proceeded to make a revolution. And what they did is they grew a new paradigm in the Indian art world. Through their art, they interrogated their own cultural practice, their own religion, their old gender norms, and their caste structures. And what they created in the end was not North or South, was not West or East, but something that was theirs, and something that they set the standard for Indian modern art. It was unity in diversity. With this story, what I really hope to share with you is how interrogation of those living the dividers of gender, race, religion, geography, how they themselves can revolutionize the power system and realize a new world. According to an article in The Lancet in 2017, the development assistance for health was $37.4 billion. So imagine, if you're a funder, as you're reviewing any of these proposals that you will get, if we were to ask the question, every time we invested, every time we said this is a proposal to go, are those that are making the change and living the problem the ones that are getting the money to frame the problem and implement the solution? It really is a simple question, but also can result in having a short-term change or a much more transformational change. This is really not new, what I'm raising. And we know by virtue of having money, funders do have the power of setting agendas and determining who acts. And this has been documented and evidenced in The Lancet again. This was McCoy et al. And Sheikh et al. In the Health Policy and Planning journals. And what it actually revealed, and I think that data needs to be updated, is that almost 70% of the money stays with the North to change the lives of the South. I'd also like to note, and I think this is sort of, and I'm going to use the term as women, sometimes there isn't always elephants in the room. But if we ourselves don't talk about this, but there was an open letter in the British Medical Journal to the Women's Leaders in Global Health Conference Steering Committee. And it is something that maybe all of us should look at in terms of sort of taking this new walk, which I really want to thank The Lancet for opening up the possibility. Another reason this is a really tough question for me, and it's a tough question to those who are making decisions, that it is about shifting the power dynamics, and along with some really practical changes. We're asking researchers and the experts to really be no longer the experts, but to rather be more enablers and supporters. It's also about the challenge of preventing a knee-jerk reaction that I am guilty of in the North, to go and just fix it. Stop the bottlenecks, get them the vaccines, get them the condoms, get them the ARVs, get them the emergency obstetric care, send the expert. Rather than really deal with some of the structural issues that I think Terry really outlined with the issues around access to abortion. This also requires us to reach outside the health world, recognizing the political determinants of health, with the fundamentalism, with the militarism, with the post-colonialism. So another issue is, what does really giving legitimacy and power to those who have and are making the change mean? How do you fund that? How does that initiative look like? How do you strengthen individual and institutional capacities so that the state and the civil society in those countries can actually prioritize and implement? There is no blueprint. And I will give a classic researcher response: it depends. So in the current context of Bolsonaro, Modi, Orban, Trump, and others, we have the choice to lead differently. Through who and what we support, we can choose to make those visible, those that are invisible more visible by virtue of their gender, their race, their geography, their sexual orientation, their ability, their class, their caste. So let us go beyond the binary of women and men. Let us go beyond the binary of North and South and put money and the destiny, with supports that are needed, in the power of those having to live and make the change, and also reach out outside the health sector.
Thank you. It's a very good transition to actually a lot of my comments. I'd like to first really thank the Lancet and Jocalyn there for the leadership that they've really shown in really putting a spotlight on these issues, bringing the evidence forward, but also standing up and showing what you're going to be doing. So finding the solutions as well. And really, can you use the microphone? Yep. Can you hear? Okay, I'll move the microphone closer. And also thank you, Terry, for hosting us here today. I think the theme of this panel in terms of, leadership on the tough issues and evidence over the ideology really speaks to the fact that gender is inherently a political issue. And we can't escape the politics of this. Unfortunately, politics and political ideology can help advance gender equality, but also, as we can see now, can easily erode progress that's been made, both on gender and global health. We're obviously currently facing a growing populist, nationalist sort of movement in different parts of the world, which are rooted in issues of social discontent, economic marginalization, also with an anti-globalization outlook and really suspicion towards some of the traditional diplomacy, migrants, foreign aid, science and public health, and multilateralism. So all of these tenets of liberal democracy that we've grown up with are really under attack and under erosion. We are now seeing sort of objective facts having less influence in terms of shaping public opinion, and these trends are starting to raise the sort of common normative consensus that we're so used to existing in and working with. But I think we also have an opportunity. We can really face these challenges by updating the global health vision that we have. That is focused on a wider effort to create a sort of liberal counter-argument to some of these trends that really reaffirms and puts at the core rights, justice, and equity for all. I mean, that really also talks to some of the disillusion that is at the heart of the current political movements that we're seeing. And gender-related determinants and the political determinants of health and gender equity must really be up front and center to this new global health vision. And I think we're starting to see some of that sort of emerging with the LancetWomen special issue, but also in the wider discourse around global health as well. We also have a number of opportunities that we can seize upon this year, and of course within the Sustainable Development Goals, including with the promotion of universal health coverage. They are really built on the foundations of equity and can be powerful equalizers. We must recommit to multilateralism. You know, these issues are relevant for everyone around the world, and these solutions, particularly addressing the structural and political determinants of this, has to be done through partnership and through conversations across countries. But we also need to ensure that the ideals of human rights are built into this, and that the links to sexual and reproductive services and gender equality are part of the common aspirations of an inclusive, sustainable development that leaves no one behind. That really is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. Of course, the UN, me being here representing the United Nations and coming from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, we recognize we do have an important role to play in preserving and promoting the scientific and evidence-based normative standards, despite these changing political ideology and winds that we're facing right now. But we must also ensure that there's strong leadership to address gender equity in universal health coverage. We have to be those voices to ensure that gender equity isn't just one of those tick-the-box issues, that they are really integrated into what universal health coverage actually means. And we have a huge opportunity this year through the General Assembly high-level meeting on universal health coverage this September, and those intergovernmental processes that will feed into a political outcome of what UHC will mean for countries. So how can we use our leadership and our voices to influence that? As we all know, progress towards international gender equality targets have really been sluggish, and we'd like to see much more progress. So more than anything, I think we need more transparency and accountability for gender equality in global health. We've seen a really great effort through the Global Health 50/50, which comes from the global health sector and has really taken a look comprehensively at gender-related policies of 140 health-related organizations. Their report came out last year. I believe they're going to be expanding their focus to 200 organizations this year. But it's really an incredible database to have a reflection in terms of what these institutions are doing and actually putting their policies and programs and action in terms of what they're doing on gender equality, not only in terms of their programs, but also in terms of their workplace policies as well. The Deputy Secretary General wrote a forward for the Global Health 50/50 report last year, really recognizing this effort within the global health sector, but calling other sectors to have a similar analysis. So we have put a mirror up to ourselves. Finally, I think we need to also really look at situating gender analysis in the context of political influences and structural inequalities, and the need to draw upon social movements to advance this work as well. I think we can really recognize the power of social movements. Of course, we have the positive changes being seen through the Me Too and Time's Up movements, but we've also seen some of the negative effects of this on public health, such as the anti-vaccine movement as well. So they are really powerful. So how do we harness the power of these social movements? I mean, it was great getting to know my panelists because we all have actually worked in the HIV field. And HIV really was one of those which created social movements and drew attention to the voices of women and those marginalized within global health. I think other examples are, of course, around the LGBTI and rights of that population. But we need to push for the rights of women, especially for underrepresented regions. I think we've heard that from the Lancet special issue, but also from the other panelists here as well. And to really ensure that these voices are there to help transform those power relations and create the enabling environments for change. Another huge opportunity, and I have a shout out here, is the Women Deliver Conference in Vancouver in June this year, which provides a unique opportunity to bring that intersectionality of gender, equality, sexual reproductive health and rights, global health together, and to really build on that further political momentum. And also we now need to take the evidence from LancetWomen and build upon the Women in Global Health social movement that we are all part of here, and to politicize those issues. and now really look at finding those solutions. What does this mean next for our institutions, for the actions as women leaders as well? But most importantly, and finally, my last comment is the importance of bringing the next generation of female and male scientists, researchers, health professionals into this social movement that we're creating and building here to find those solutions for the change that we're really seeking.
Thank you. Before I open it up, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I wanted to ask my co-panelists about the issue of donors creating silos. We are trying very hard to not just be a researcher who works on gender-based violence, a researcher who works on norm shifting, a researcher who works on the impact of law, because usually in the individual woman it all comes together, yet the fields are really very separate. So any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I think this is one of the critical issues that we are facing within global health, and particularly in terms of that fragmentation within the donor community, but also within our own specialties as well. Because ultimately, if we put people at the center and rights and needs at the center of global health, and the realities of what that means for people on the ground is that they don't live their lives in those silos. And also, we're seeing a plateauing of development assistance for health, and with our current climate for foreign aid and development assistance, that picture is not necessarily going to be improving. So how can we actually create much more efficiency gains by having more coherent, joined up donor response to country needs and people's needs to health? I think this is one of the critical issues, and of course linking that to sustainable financing. I don't think the answers are only going to be within donors and foundations in terms of what changes can be made. We need to really instill a lot of these issues and recognition of gender equality in global health within national programs, and that requires a huge uptake and scale up of domestic resource financing for this.
So you called us out, Terry. And yes, it is a really big issue, and this is something that I think as donors we do try to do the collaboration, but it's also seen in the financing mechanism. And I'm putting the appeal to people who work more in the global scheme and looking at Nina, that you got Gavi, you got Global Fund, you got the GFF, I mean a whole pot of acronyms. So you got this money in different streams. You've got different donors supporting the different streams. I know the GFF was meant to bring people together and everything under the one group, but when it lands to the people in terms of things like how do you strengthen system, it goes differently. And then on top of it, this is the health world. Then you have the humanitarian sector. You have 250 billion migrants in the world. So that's like, these are 250 billion people that are out of any sort of democratic process. You have the UN with their humanitarian funds coming in, and then you have your multilateral, your ODA aids coming in. So there is a lot of division, and I don't know the answer. I can just say in terms of the funders, we do try, and it is about the collaboration. I would suggest that those who get money fight back, say, can we not? If you've got one reporting mechanism, if you've got 5 different metrics of monitoring and evaluation, come back to the donor and say, can we not just do one? So there's got to be a bit of push and pull.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 comments or questions? Yes.
Hi there, Susan Papp. I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at Women Deliver. One of the things that I was interested in hearing from the panel about is age, and looking at the intersecting identities and those who are disenfranchised. Young people, particularly young women, are among the most disenfranchised, particularly when you look at HIV. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about making sure that they're part of the equation.
So the OSF, good point. in terms of how they're part of the equation. Our women's rights program deals a lot of work with youth. This is in the Open Society Foundation, and it's quite interesting, and this speaks to how donors work. The public health programs actually break things down by marginalized groups. And we look at issues around sex workers, we look at people who use drugs, we look at trans and intersex people. And within that community, we support the leaders in those groups to actually look at that issue. HIV/AIDS, 80% of the epidemic is with women, and it is the youth. I think this also has to be intersected with looking, especially in Africa, with youth unemployment. We don't want to look at the health issue without looking at the employment issue. So I'm not really sure that you've answered the question, but I think maybe some of the work with the UN that Nana probably does try to bring this together.
I just wanted to comment quickly that, we have terrible, terrible gaps in data for young people. Not that I'm a data person, but I've become more of a data person, and we know virtually nothing about unmarried 10 to 14-year-olds around the world. This is a gap that is consistently pointed out, and we don't seem to ever fix it. So just to say, that's really very, very important.
Actually, I think looking at bringing young people in more as the drivers of change here, the global health community, despite having lots of gaps on data with adolescents, and my work with Every Woman, Every Child, and really putting a focus on adolescent health and needs was one of the sort of key achievements, I think, of some of its work, has actually been leading the thinking around the UN's engagement with young people. I would say adolescent health and well-being has probably more of the social movements behind it, as well as at least the start of some of the disaggregated data being collected and integrated into national health surveillance systems. But I do see a trend in terms of recognizing the need to have young people at the table and including young people's voices in policy making at the UN. The Secretary General actually launched a youth strategy last September during UN General Assembly, which really looks at some of these issues. But I think, again, we're at that next stage of, okay, beyond recognizing it within rhetoric, how do we actually land this in terms of policies and programs? But I think Women Deliver is actually one of the other champion organizations really putting a really strong youth leaders program together, which I must admit, looking across different sectors and fields, one of the strongest youth capacity building programs around there. And we need to have more investments in these types of initiatives and efforts as well.
Thank you. Last comment, Nina.
Hi, yeah, my name is Nina Schwalbe. I'm on the faculty here, and I'm in a 12-step ex-UN recovery program, and my question is to Nana. The UN right now, agencies are in global, she was going to be on my panel later, I was going to ask this, but thought she took a pass. UN is in total crisis now. We have total crisis at UNAIDS, we have crisis at WHO, and we're about to see crisis at UNICEF, which is doing a similar review. Talk to us, Nana, what's the future? Is the UN taking this seriously, or are we going to see reform? Thanks.
Okay, last word.
That's the reason why I left her panel. Thank you, Nina. No, I actually appreciate that question. I've been with to be honest, majority of my career has been with the UN. Not all, but majority. So I've been with the UN over 15 years. I have seen those issues as my career has progressed through the United Nations. And your question is, right now, with a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the press and the crises that you mentioned, is there hope? Are we serious about the changes that are being put in place? And I would say yes. I think for the first time, we really have very, very strong leadership from the top when it comes to addressing sexual harassment, abuse as well, and really putting in place structures to address this. Of course, as many of you know, the UN is very decentralized with many different entities. The current efforts are really instructed across the whole UN system in terms of putting in place mechanisms for staff to report sexual harassment and abuse, but also to strengthen the investigation capacity of the UN. So we actually have a strengthened internal investigation office with predominantly female investigators. That was for the first time we actually looked at that issue of having female investigators. But of course, we need to ensure that there is real change and accountability as well. I actually see it is encouraging that we're seeing a lot of these cases come up and be reported, because that there is obviously the space for staff to come out and actually report that these things are happening. And I don't think obviously this is just an issue within the UN. This is an issue in many institutions and multilateral institutions as well. I think that with the gender parity strategy that the Secretary General launched at the beginning of his tenure, he's really delivered on that at the senior management level. We have reached gender parity at the senior management level, including also the resident coordinators at country level. We've already reached gender parity there, but there is a lot more to be done. We've set ourselves goals and targets by 2021 to reach those gender parity targets. And I think that the role of stakeholders and partners to keep us accountable and transparent to achieving those goals will also be really, really critical.
Okay, I think we're over time. Okay, go ahead. Please, last point.
Lori Garrett, just to follow up on that. I mean, I don't know, you said there's suspicion of the multilateral system. You bet there is. And when we look at what's happened with UNAIDS so far, nobody believes the institution is going to change. Why was Luis Loris allowed to stay under Assistant Secretary of the entire, or Assistant Director General of the entire UN system for so long? Why hasn't Michelle Sidibe had any accountability? Why now do we hear rumors? Those of us who are, journalists that people reach out to, we're getting fed rumors that the complaining women were a secret cabal of lesbians. This is the kind of crap that's going on. Why should we believe there's going to be any real change?
Okay. All right then, last words from our panelists. I mean, I have nothing to add to your comment. There's lots and lots of questions, I think, for sure.
I just want to say that actually these are the tough dialogues we need to have. It's got to be out there and honest. So thank you for those questions and pulling that. And if we're not, I mean, the Lancet has given us a great foundation and a springboard for these. And if we can do it within ourselves, we're much stronger and we're going to get the change we want. So thank you for attending, and thank you to Jocalyn and Becca.
I would fully echo that. I really welcome this open dialogue and the discussion on those tough issues. I think the LancetWomen issue has really brought forward the realities of what we face in workplaces, and each of us really can be that leader to help make that change. And Laurie, I'm on the inside there, and I totally hear you, and I reassure you that we are serious about the change there, but totally hear the comment that you made.
Okay, so I want to thank our panelists and welcome the complexity that we have brought to this discussion. I'm really tired of simple conversations about gender, so I encourage everyone to continue with the complexity. Thank you.
Okay, and we're just, no, okay.
there's a clicker.
Oh, there is a clicker. Oh, actually, I'll just use that. Yeah, it's just this one. Hi, so just once again want to really thank you for being here and listening and engaging with us on this. In a way, this is sort of re-gearing towards another different part of what we do, and we have made many references to the fact that we are a medical journal, so we do actually do some kind of what we call straight clinical work. But in listening to the two sessions before us, it occurred to me that, you know, whenever we think of something that is purely clinical, then maybe it's really not. And especially now that I'm going to be talking specifically about a commission that I am helping to work on, it really occurs to me how there is that sort of fluidity between these topics. So I am going to sort of put this in the context of that, you know, the Lancet really wants to serve as a forum for moving this agenda forward, that nothing that we do is intended to be sort of a static product. Everything is supposed to be dynamic and process driven, and so when it comes to commissions, that's really something that we consider. Jocalyn did an amazing job of pointing out some of the things that we've been doing at the Lancet. This is sort of a distillation from other talks that I've given about some of the different initiatives that inside our journal, what we've hoped to accomplish. And one of the pieces that I've sort of added here is to actually look at the clinical work that bears on health for women, and especially around gender and sex differences. And this is one way that we have really tried to push that envelope. So, oops, there we go. You've probably noticed during all of these talks that this little message down here, the best science for better lives, is there. And it's really the credo of the Lancet. And we really do firmly believe that what we're doing is trying to achieve better science that will actually help people's lives. And so, but importantly, the best science is the most equitable science. And it's the most accurate science, and it becomes the foundation for all the decision making. And so we really want to be part of that. But the corollary of that is that organized science also provides a platform for advocacy. And so I've been thinking too about the Lancet's role as sort of in midwifery, because we sort of serve as this intermediary where we have the, you know, thought leaders and people doing the work come through us. We help you kind of map out what your birth plan is, and then hopefully when things go totally different than that, we're still there to catch the baby. So again, it's all coming back to this idea of equity and how do we get closer to that. So I am really delighted to announce today, this is sort of the formal announcement of this commission that we've convened with Mount Sinai on women and cardiovascular disease. And there is a comment being published today, and it puts it in the context of considering this as a shift. That this is, it is a momentous time, but it's really about the beginning of this next phase of how we think about women's health. And not to go through this in depth, but I just wanted to point out a couple things of what is the purpose of having a commission in the first place. And a commission is really about convening experts to think about a problem. And in this case, we know cardiovascular disease is a huge problem for women, and I will have Dr. Birgit Vogel talk more in depth about that. But we've known for a long time that women have much poorer outcomes when it comes to cardiovascular disease than men. But why is that the case? Do we know? So the purpose of this commission is to really go through the evidence base and figure out what it is that we know. And then from there to come up with, we've often used the phrase as lowest hanging fruit, but what can we action from that? What is the first wave of achievements that we can point out by making recommendations? And then also to elevate awareness globally. So again here, when the clinical and the global health worlds meet, to make this a global effort and to make sure that women's care around the world is going to improve. And then also a springboard, so the idea that it's not a static product, that these are people moving into the future, working on this problem actively. So I would just like to point out that the other really amazing things about this commission, there are a few of them. One is that it's all women. And we didn't actually intend to come up with a commission that was all women. It just sort of happened this way. And I think we've seen some data that supports why that might be. And interestingly, we tried to do our best to get mid and younger career people who are from different parts of medicine. So not only people who are interventional cardiologists like Dr. Roxana Moran, who's our lead commissioner, but also people who work in public health, people who do primary care. We really want to think about this from the beginning stage of when a woman might have any interaction with medical care and further on. And so I'm going to pass now to Dr. Birgit Vogel, who's up there, and she's going to be talking a little bit more about some of the specifics of what we've unpacked.
Thank you so much, Beck, and it's a great honor to be here and be part of this and be the one that represents all these amazing women experts all over the world that have come together to work on this Lancet Commission on women and cardiovascular disease, or what I like better, cardiovascular health. So I want to give a brief overview of the global burden of cardiovascular disease in women, and I want to start with this that shows cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide in women and in men, and it hasn't changed since 1990. So here we see a map of leading causes of years of life lost in women in 2016, and you see in this greenish color ischemic heart disease, which is the #1, and it spreads around the whole globe. So we have, this is a publication with, which used data from the Global Burden of Disease study and looked at the 10 most common causes of cardiovascular disease-related death, and you see all the causes here on this list. And this Global Burden of Disease study uses country-level surveillance data, verbal autopsy, vital registration, published and unpublished disease registries, and published scientific reports. And they showed that in 2015 there were 17.9 million deaths from cardiovascular disease, including 8.5 million females. And the good news is there were declines in the age-standardized cardiovascular disease death rate, but it really was limited to the all high-income countries and some of the middle-income countries. And as I said, ischemic heart disease was the #1 cause. So they also analyzed these data according to the socio-demographic index of the regions, and that is a measure of the socio-demographic development, which is based on average income, the educational attainment, and total fertility rate. So 0 is the lowest income, lowest educational attainment, and highest total fertility rate, and 1 is the opposite. And the most striking of these results were that in the most developed countries with the highest SDI, there was a decrease, sharply decrease for both sexes. But when you look at the least developed countries with a very low social demographic index, then you see that the highest cardiovascular disease mortality shifts from men to women. So in the least developed countries, it's really cardiovascular disease mortality is a problem of the women. This is another publication that looked at future risk factor scenarios, actually also using data from the Global Burden of Disease study. And the background is the following. So the United Nations member states have agreed to reduce premature cardiovascular disease mortality by 25% in the year 2025. And this analysis produced estimates to show how selected risk factor reduction would affect cardiovascular disease mortality for different regions and countries. And I know this is very busy, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but this shows the data on women, and you see as the dotted line here, this is the goal that the UN members decided they want to achieve. And in green line, The green line represents a scenario where all the targets were met for risk factors. And the orange line is the one that represents a scenario if everything would just go on at the current trend. So as you see that some regions, even in the most optimal situation, when they would achieve all the risk factor targets, they are far from this goal that was set. And this is true for Central Asia, it's true for Central Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also true for Eastern Europe. And then I want to point out to another region like Western Europe, where even if everything would continue at the current trend, they would reach this goal that was set. So there are a lot of differences between these regions, and also I want to point out that the scales differ significantly, so the baseline mortality is much different within these regions. So to summarize, there was overall, most regions saw a decline in the risk of premature cardiovascular disease mortality between 2013 and 2025, according to these estimates, but the magnitude varied widely. So the largest was actually in Asia, high-income Asia-Pacific, with 32% decline cardiovascular disease mortality in women. But there was also estimates that show that if everything continues at this current trend, there will be an increase in a lot of regions for the mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality in women. And that is some parts in Asia, Eastern Europe, Oceania, and Western Sub-Saharan Africa. So they also looked at what is the most important risk factor that should be addressed, which would have the greatest impact. And they saw that globally, the next leading single risk factor target after hypertension depended on sex. So a halt in the rise of obesity had the second largest impact for women, whereas for men it was the reduction in smoking. I also want to point out this was not true for all the regions, like in high-income Asia-Pacific and Western Europe, it was actually smoking for women as well and not obesity. So these data are most valuable for us and to identify targets and gaps and see what is going on globally, but we also have to acknowledge the huge limitations of these data, so including misclassification bias, garbage codes, and also we have to recognize that health data on cardiovascular disease remains extremely limited for some regions of the world, such as India and Sub-Saharan Africa. This is the data quality showing best quality in blue and the least quality in red across the world. So to summarize this first part of my talk, cardiovascular disease is still the #1 cause of death in women, and there was some mortality decline, but it really was limited to high-income regions, and this was not shown by the slides because I had to shorten it a little bit, there was actually a plateau, especially over the last decade, and I want to discuss this a little bit later. So in countries with low STI, in low developed countries, the cardiovascular disease mortality rates shift from men to women. And assuming that there is no change, we have seen there are many regions where the cardiovascular disease mortality will increase if we don't change. Globally, the next leading single risk factor target after hypertension was obesity in women. So, and now I want to go back to this decline of the cardiovascular disease mortality in Western countries and say that the Global Burden of Disease study also has seen that especially among the last decade, there was actually a plateau of this reduction. And also this study supported this and identified especially young adults and especially young women to be affected by this. So, and this leads me to the next topic, which is also a very important issue and will be included in our work on the Lancet Commission. It's the underrepresentation of women in clinical trials, and it's especially young women that are underrepresented. And I want to give a brief overview of the history of the enrollment of women in clinical trials. And it really started in the 1970s when the policies on including women in clinical research originate from the women's health movement in the 1970s. But then in 1977, there was a drawback when the FDA recommended to exclude women of childbearing potential from phase 1 and early phase 2 drug trials. So this was a very broad recommendation, and it was mostly due to some drug-related incidences, including the thalidomide administration to pregnant women and the resulting tragedy. So this recommendation resulted in a wide exclusion of women from clinical trials. And in the 1980s, patients and women's health advocacy groups voiced disapproval of the FDA recommendation. Many believed that the women should decide themselves if they want to take the risk in trial participation. And there was also a report of the Public Health Service Task Force on Women's Health Issues in 1985 that recommended and said we need long-term research on how behavior, biology, and social factors affect women's health. So as a response, in 1986, the NIH adopted a policy to encourage the inclusion of women in clinical trials. And this was actually turned into federal law when Congress approved the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993. In the same year, the FDA reversed the 1977 guidance and encouraged the inclusion of women in clinical trials. So these were very important changes and developments, but it was also shown in some reports that, that these policies were applied only inconsistently and the change was very slow. Nevertheless, it resulted also in the first sex-specific clinical recommendations and guidelines for the prevention of cardiovascular disease in women, which were published by the AHA in 1999 and 2004. And unfortunately, when this analysis showed, this is actually the, on the trials that were included in the guidelines in the 2007 guidelines, so an update showed that these trials that these guidelines were based on still had very low female enrollment, especially hypertension, heart failure, and hyperlipidemia were less than 30%. And even today, so this is a very recent publication that looked at participation of women in clinical trials supporting FDA approval of cardiovascular drugs, the ratio of female enrollment and the prevalence of the disease in women is far from optimal, especially for certain diseases like heart failure and coronary artery disease, acute coronary syndrome. So there must be other reasons than just the FDA policy from 1977, and it was hypothesized that inclusion and exclusion criteria may disproportionately exclude women from studies on ischemic heart disease. Reasons for this include the older age and the excess of comorbidities of women compared to men when they present with coronary artery disease. In addition, it was repeatedly documented that women receive less invasive treatment and less guideline recommended treatment, which may preclude them for participation in interventional trials. The data by Scott et al. That I just showed had also some very limited data actually on the screening in these trials, and it suggested that the sex bias study entry criteria were not the main reason for the lower enrollment of women. So we really have to look far and deeper into this and understand the reasons why this is still the case, especially in cardiovascular disease trials. So why is it that women are less likely than men to consider participation in trials and or to be considered for screening? And there are studies, very few and with limited data, but they found that women are more reluctant compared to men to participate in clinical trials. They documented differences in perceived probability of experiencing harm and benefits. And they also documented concern about the participation being a burden on health and time. And another one mentioned caring responsibilities that was mentioned by women but not by men. So this commission is not only to outline the gaps and targets that we have to address, but also come up with strategies to improve. And these are some of the strategies that relate to the underrepresentation for women in clinical trials. And I don't want to comment on all of them, but I think most importantly is to raise awareness and to educate and to train the recruiting personnel and make them understand how important it is to have data on women from clinical trials. And maybe they have to spend a little bit of extra efforts and explain and discuss the risks, but also the benefits of participation in a clinical trial, and include maybe family members and make them aware how important it is for them, but also for all women, including their daughters and granddaughters. So there are other strategies that just make it easier for the participation, like offering free transportation, flexible hours, at-home follow-up, and so on. So this shows the overall participation of women in clinical trials, and it doesn't look so bad. Like for United States, 49% is great, but as we saw, especially for cardiovascular disease trials, it's much less. And in other countries, it's even worse. So there is still a long way to go. And this is why the Commission is so important, and why it is so important that it's a global initiative, that we all work together and see what are the gaps and what are the targets and what are the special issues in specific regions of the world. What is the access for care, to care for women in different countries. And we brought this whole group from all over the world to identify all these issues and come up with solutions and raise awareness and hopefully improve cardiovascular health in women. Thank you.
I don't think we have any questions for this period. So, you did? Oh, well, yeah, I think we have time for questions. I wasn't sure if I didn't see anyone.
You didn't mention the Bernadine Healy promoted women's health study with a very controversial promotion of estrogen at menopause and lifelong thereafter, and the deleterious impact it had on the credibility. Can you talk about that?
That's true. So I had to actually cut this down a little bit in order to be not too long. But this was all, so from NIH, there was a great response actually as I said, in 1986, when they came up with this policy to actually encourage the inclusion of women in clinical trials. And then Bernadine Healy as the first female director, and this huge study that they invented. So there is a lot of effort from there, and it definitely has resulted in change. But as we see, and especially this is true for cardiovascular disease trials, it's not where we want to be, and there is still a long way to go. So
can't help but say that in 1993, it was a woman from Johns Hopkins was kept out with she had HIV, very sick. She was kept out of a trial because of the 77 guideline, and her doctor called where I worked, and we ended up filing, along with many community groups, a citizen petition attacking the 1977 FDA guideline, and we got it removed. So just so you have that piece of the story, it was a lot of activism. It didn't just disappear. And in fact, as part of there was a much bigger struggle, so I'm happy to talk to you about it, but I just wanted to shout out to all the activists who made that guideline disappear.
thank you for this input. Actually, I think it's probably, this talk is too short to really delineate all these changes and developments and all the efforts that have been taken for us today to be in this situation that has already that is already improved, but we cannot stop now, and we have to go on and put more effort in this. But thank you for this.
Oh, I would also say that, you know, one of the really interesting things about growing a commission from the seeds up here is that, you know, we have been talking with advocacy groups and talking with patients about what is important to them as well. And so as this commission sort of coalesces, having that perspective, I think, is very important. So it's a point well taken. And that the message has to be tailored to different groups. There is not one size that fits all. So we're going to really spend time, I think, thinking about that.
Great, thank you. So we know it's not just about sex-specific disparities, but also gender-specific disparities, racial disparities, and I'm just wondering how you're accounting for how sex and gender intersect with other social stratifiers in your work to look at, you know, enrollment to trials, but also morbidity, mortality from cardiovascular disease.
So I can say that we are in a stage that we appreciate actually all of these inputs, and we have come up with certain topics that we also drafted sections on it when we are reviewing, but we are still, I think, at a stage that we want to explore what are the most important targets, what are the needs, and actually I would love to hear all these comments and inputs, if you don't mind, to give to us, and only in this conversation I think we can do something really great. So thank you for this, and I hope we can build on this.
So I noticed one of the things you mentioned was that you don't want to have an upper limit for age in terms of women, which is great. But oftentimes what we lack is data on reproductive aged women, because they fall into this trap of, you know, you have to be on contraception so that you don't get pregnant for a clinical trial, but then the contraception might interact with the medication, so now you can't be on it. If you're on contraception, you can't be in it if you could potentially get pregnant, and so they run into that problem. And I was just wondering if there's any focus on getting reproductive age data, and then as a kind of a second point to that is data in pregnancy, because especially in cardiovascular disease, some of the medications we use to manage even blood pressure in pregnancy are these old drugs, because we just don't have good data.
Thank you so much for this, and you're absolutely right. It's not only the older age, but really also the younger age that we have to include. And this was the problem that was raised initially, to exclude completely women of childbearing potential. That was fortunately reversed. But still, I think there are exclusion criteria by many trials that would not support the inclusion of this target population. And I think the Commission is here that this should be an important point to address, to also how can we come up with a solution that is safe for the woman, but also gives us the knowledge that we need. Thank you so much.